He laughed at a painting and mocked the artist, without knowing she was the daughter of the man whose life he'd helped destroy. That single smirk would set off a chain reaction of exposure, collapse, and a reckoning he couldn't escape. Elliot Lancaster had no idea the street art he belittled was not only a trap for his ego, but a message from a past he thought he'd erased. This story begins with a cruel laugh and ends with a man learning that power, once weaponized, will always demand a price. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. New York moved like it always did, impatient, sharp, full of importance. But inside the penthouse of Elliot Lancaster, the morning paused. He sat alone in silence, running his index finger down the spine of an antique catalog, searching not for beauty, but for something to prove his dominance to the next round of foreign dignitaries and CEOs who'd sip wine under the glow of his status. The walls of his apartment, though decorated by some of the world's most celebrated pieces, felt empty to him. Not for lack of decoration, but for lack of something no one else could ever own. He had just left a meeting in Chelsea where money moved faster than reason. On the street outside, executives in tailored coats burst out of a glass building, chuckling about quarterly reports and empty calories. One pointed to a woman painting on the sidewalk. "She paints like she's hiding from her past," he scoffed. The others laughed. Elliot turned, intrigued, not by art, but by arrogance. He crossed the street and saw her, a woman in a plain jacket, dark curls tied back with a cloth, bent over a canvas that vibrated with color. Her hands moved like they remembered something painful. She didn't flinch when he stood beside her, only tightened a final stroke and looked up. Meeting his gaze with calm defiance, he studied the painting with a squint that tried to pass for interest. It was abstract but intimate, a burst of conflicted blues and charcoal lines like veins splitting a heart. He didn't ask her name. He simply pulled out his wallet and said, "I'll take it." She didn't argue, just handed him the rolled canvas and said, "This is a painting about choices." Her eyes lingered on him as she said it, unblinking, deliberate. He returned her look with a detached smirk, turned, and left. No name, no real thanks, just the casual dismissal of a man who believed money erased context. Back in the penthouse, Elliot dropped the painting near a coat rack like it was dry cleaning. Before that, he held it up to the light and joked with his house staff about the emerging peasant chic vibe of the piece. He didn't speak cruelly, just with the chilling ease of a man who didn't think anything beneath his interest could matter. Later that evening, over brandy and charcuterie, he showed it to guests. "Street art," he said, voice honeyed with sarcasm. A little experiment in proletarian passion. Laughter followed. It was enough for Elliot. Everything, as far as he knew, was right where it should be, but something in the image unsettled him, not that he'd admit it. He placed it between two Greco-Roman busts and forgot about it by the next day. What he didn't know, and would not understand until much later, was that the moment he accepted that painting, he had activated a quiet, intricate machine designed for collapse. The artist hadn't painted a picture. She had set a fuse that night. She didn't sleep. In a modest Brooklyn apartment shared with her aging grandmother, Leah Harper sat by an open window, her arms speckled with dried paint. The phone on her table buzzed with 3 messages, none of which she opened. She had watched Elliot take the painting. She'd seen his disgust disguised as interest. She'd felt the flicker of recognition when he examined her work. He hadn't realized it. Not yet, but the pattern on that canvas echoed another set of paintings he'd buried with the past. She didn't need him to understand now. That would come. For now, the painting had done its job. It was inside his home, inside his circle. A Trojan horse that wouldn't explode but unravel, slowly, relentlessly. She stepped into the kitchen and poured tea for her grandmother, who sat quietly at the table knitting. "You gave it to him?" the old woman asked, not looking up. Leah nodded. "Good," her grandmother said. "Then you're done with that chapter." Leah shook her head. "No," she whispered. "I just wrote the first page." In the days that followed, Elliot continued with his usual routines: calls with lawyers, lunch with industrialists, tastings at private clubs. But each time he passed the painting, he paused. Something about it kept catching his eye, something familiar in the composition. He found himself mentioning it more than he expected, even Googling the artist on impulse. Nothing came up. Just Leah. No last name. No website. No price tags. It irritated him. Then came the party he'd invited his usual guest list of powerful, tasteless elites. The room buzzed with jokes wrapped in irony, outfits worth more than most people's rent, and conversations that orbited wealth like moths to light. Elliot unveiled the painting with flair, framing it dramatically between two oversized mirrors. A new acquisition, he announced, by a prodigy of the pavement. He toasted to the authenticity of struggle, and his guests howled with laughter. Smells like acrylic and desperation, someone chuckled. Elliot waved it off, amused, but not everyone in the room was laughing. A waiter, young, sharp-eyed, and unimpressed, snapped a photo of the painting with his phone. Later that night, he posted it on social media with a biting caption, "When art climbs the ladder of ego, what happens if it falls?" By morning, the post had gone viral. Within hours, art students, critics, and bloggers were dissecting every brushstroke. A few saw echoes of David Harper's signature style, an artist from the early 2000s whose disappearance after a career scandal had become myth. Some suggested the painting wasn't just inspired by him, it was a ghost of him, a continuation. Meanwhile, Leah watched the chaos quietly from her room. Her grandmother folded laundry in the next room, humming a forgotten tune. Leah opened her sketchbook and drew, not to document, but to prepare. She had more to say, and Elliot, whether he knew it or not, had just invited the world into the first conversation that he had made her visible. Now, she would make him remember. Elliot Lancaster had hosted dozens of opulent soirees, but none crackled quite like the night he unveiled the controversial painting. The buzz wasn't about the champagne or the guest list. It was the portrait staring defiantly between two antique mirrors, surrounded by polished laughter and thinly veiled mockery. The room, filled with collectors, tycoons, and media consultants, bathed in arrogance, never guessing that the piece they ridiculed was igniting a cultural wildfire outside those gilded walls. The more Elliot joked, the more attention he drew to it. By midnight, his phone buzzed with notifications, most of which he ignored, believing them to be the usual digital static. What he missed was the shift in tone. What began as ridicule had morphed into fascination, and fascination always bred scrutiny. A BY morning, the viral post had birthed thousands of comments, with artists, historians, and amateur detectives dissecting every color and curve. Some claimed the brushwork was hauntingly familiar. A few went further, posting side-by-side comparisons to obscure, unpublished works by David Harper, a forgotten genius believed to have vanished under mysterious circumstances. The internet wasn't just gossiping anymore, it was excavating. Threads appeared on forums speculating about Elliot's connection to Harper. Someone uncovered a grainy photo from 1998 showing them at an art gala, smiling like brothers. It didn't take long before the name David Harper began trending alongside Elliot's. Inside his office, Elliot stared at the screen as if watching a ghost resurrect itself. He hadn't spoken Harper's name in over a decade, hadn't allowed it to be uttered inside his business or his home. But the past didn't care about silence. His assistant handed him a printed article from an academic journal titled Echoes of the Abandoned, in which a retired professor pointed out the undeniable continuity between Harper's abandoned style and the mysterious new street artist's work. A paragraph at the end chilled Elliot. The emotional geometry is not imitated, it's inherited. If this artist isn't Harper reborn, they are certainly Harper's blood. He dropped the paper, his pulse now beating with an edge he hadn't felt in years. The memory came uninvited. A boardroom, the sound of a door slamming, the flash of betrayal. He'd buried all that, paid enough to keep the silence thick and compliant. Yet here it was, clawing its way back through pigment and canvas. He told himself it was coincidence, that the internet thrived on conspiracy. But when he read the name in one of the newer articles, Leah Harper, he stood abruptly. The name wasn't just familiar, it was final. She wasn't a stranger. She was the daughter. Panic didn't show on Elliot's face. It wasn't his style, but it swelled inside him like smoke behind a sealed door. He called his lawyer, made inquiries, traced her publicly listed addresses. She'd vanished from social media the moment the buzz started, and reporters couldn't get more than a shrug from her grandmother. Every attempt to connect was met with silence. And that silence, so complete, terrified him. It wasn't the silence of someone overwhelmed. It was the silence of someone in control. Meanwhile, Leah moved with deliberate stillness. She didn't chase the story. She didn't give interviews, didn't sign with agents. Offers came, some with 7 figures. But she let them expire like rotten fruit. Every gesture she made was a contradiction to what the art world expected. She gave away 2 paintings to a public school, another to a community center. People called her enigmatic, rebellious, a marketing genius. She wasn't any of those things. She was resolved. This wasn't about building a career. It was about building a reckoning that as she watched Elliot's empire begin to tremble, Leah painted again, not vengeance, not portraits, but moments. Memories of her father at a small easel, humming absent-mindedly, brushing color into grief. She remembered the night the shouting stopped in their home, how the lights never came back on in his studio. He hadn't died in a crash or a scandal. He had simply disappeared into shame, exiled by whispers. Elliot hadn't pulled the trigger, but he'd loaded the gun. And Leah had inherited every bullet. Journalists came knocking. A Netflix producer offered her a documentary. Museums called. She said no. Instead, she held an unannounced exhibit in a local church hall. No tickets, no press. Just 12 paintings hung in silence, each more intense than the last. Words spread in whispers. Lines formed. People wept in front of her canvases, unsure why. Each visitor left changed, but no one was allowed to photograph or record. The mystery only deepened. Who was Leah Harper, and what had she come to show them? Elliot, cornered by public curiosity, finally gave a statement, half apology, half deflection. He denied ever intending to insult the artist. He called it a misunderstanding, but the press wasn't buying it, and the internet had already decided. He was the villain in a story whose ending he no longer controlled. Critics began dissecting not just his comments, but his history. Anonymous tips flooded in. Someone leaked a document about Harper's sudden exit from their firm. A redacted settlement. Dates matched. Guilt solidified. His investors grew uneasy. Calls stopped being returned. An emergency board meeting was held without him. One of the company founders, once his loyal ally, suggested he take an indefinite leave. Let it blow over, he said. But Elliot knew storms like this didn't blow over. They redefined the landscape. He walked out without replying, went straight to his penthouse, and stared at the space where the painting once hung. He'd hidden it days ago, unable to bear its gaze. Now the absence was louder than the image ever was. Leah didn't gloat. She painted, and when asked by a friend why she wasn't answering the world, she simply said, "Answers are for questions that come from honesty. I haven't heard any yet." The friend didn't understand. He didn't need to. Her purpose wasn't revenge, it was return. She wasn't punishing Elliot. She was returning what he'd broken. And as more people saw her work, more people remembered her father, not as a scandal, but as a soul. Leah had done what Elliot could never do, make people feel something real. That was power, and Elliot, for all his bravado, had finally felt something too. For the first time in years, he was afraid. Not of being canceled, not of losing wealth, but of being irrelevant, of being remembered not as a titan, but as a coward who once laughed at truth and mistook it for decoration. The first time Elliot saw his name next to David Harper's in a headline, he chuckled dismissively. By the third article, his smile had vanished. The New York Times published a piece titled, "The Man Who Laughed at the Artist, and Perhaps at His Own Reflection." It wasn't just a jab, it was a loaded accusation masked in irony. Overnight, Elliot shifted from elite tastemaker to cautionary tale. He told his team to do damage control, but the problem wasn't media, it was memory. People weren't inventing a scandal, they were rediscovering one. The past he'd paid to smother had grown roots, and now it was blooming in front of an audience hungry for justice. He issued a carefully crafted statement through a PR firm, downplaying any real association with Harper beyond a brief creative partnership. But art historians, former interns, even one of Harper's former lovers began to surface online, each adding detail to a story that no longer obeyed Elliot's script. The pressure increased when a respected curator pointed out uncanny similarities between the painting Elliot mocked and an unfinished series Harper was rumored to have been working on before his disappearance. A whisper became a claim. The painting wasn't just inspired by Harper's style, it was his legacy continued by blood. And Elliot had mocked it in front of mirrors, champagne, and applause. Letters began to arrive at his apartment. Not emails, handwritten. Notes, brief, disjointed, unmistakably personal. The first read, "You always hated things you couldn't own." Another, "The brush never lied. You just refused to listen." He dismissed the first few as online trolls going analog. But one evening, after a sleepless night, he opened a letter that quoted something only Harper would have said. "Trust is like light in paint. Once you kill it, you can't mix it back." Elliot froze. That phrase had been spoken during a brutal argument in their shared studio decades earlier, when Harper had accused him of stealing a concept for a high-profile commission. It had never been repeated. No one could have known, unless they'd been there, or were family. The connection finally exploded into the mainstream when an art journalist published a timeline linking Elliot's acquisition of their early gallery to a series of abrupt legal filings and one suspicious payout labeled only as creative transition settlement. It became clear to the public that Elliot hadn't just walked away from Harper. He'd pushed him off the stage, bought the silence, and erased the footprint. Leah's appearance now felt orchestrated by fate, her presence poetic. People weren't just angry at Elliot for the past. They saw his mockery of her work as symbolic violence, history repeating itself with smug indifference. The stock in Elliot's firm began to wobble. Clients grew uneasy. One major investor called him directly, not with questions, but with a warning. "You're not the asset anymore," he said flatly. "You're the liability." Elliot didn't argue. He'd already stopped showing up to board meetings in person. His driver had noticed the shift, how Elliot sat in silence, no longer taking calls, just staring out the window with the posture of someone trying to measure invisible damage. At night, he began closing all the curtains, turning off the lights before sunset. The painting was locked in a guest room he refused to enter, but he heard it in dreams. Always the same, standing in front of it, unable to move, while voices behind him laughed with Harper's laugh. The final blow came not from the press, but from within. One of the company's co-founders arranged a private gathering of board members. It wasn't a coup, not officially, but when Elliot arrived, the mood was unmistakable. Polite condolences masked sharp decisions. A senior advisor laid out the situation coldly. They were bleeding trust. His resignation would stop the hemorrhaging. "You leave now, quietly, and we control the story. Stay, and you become it." Elliot didn't argue. He stood, nodded once, and walked out. The door shut behind him with a weight that felt like a verdict. He didn't return to his penthouse that night. He walked for hours, through streets where no one recognized him anymore, past galleries that once begged for his presence, past restaurants where his name was once whispered for priority seating. He ended up sitting in a small cafe in Harlem, staring into a black coffee, as if it could explain how a life built on winning could lose so silently. He remembered Harper's voice again, not angry, but disappointed. "You think silence is safety, but it's just cowardice that paid well." Back in Brooklyn, Leah received a message from a gallery owner offering a solo exhibition in Paris. She declined again. Instead, she organized a free showing in an abandoned warehouse, open only at night, with no press allowed. Each night, she hung one new painting. No signs, no explanations. People came because they heard the silence was profound, and they left changed. Her grandmother watched all of it with quiet pride. "Is he gone yet?" she asked one evening. Leah replied, "He's disappearing." That's slower. Elliot's disappearance began with headlines about his resignation. Then silence. Rumors swirled about therapy, rehab, retreat. He let them swirl. He sold the apartment without ceremony. He declined interviews, shredded invitations. He kept only a few books, a coat, and a photograph from 1997. Him and Harper, in paint-stained clothes, laughing in front of their first shared exhibit. A reminder that there was once something real before ambition turned everything false. One morning, he wrote a letter. Not a press release, not a statement, just a simple letter. It said, "I mocked what I didn't understand and destroyed what I was too proud to admit mattered. I won't ask forgiveness, but I wanted you to know I finally see it." He mailed it to the only address he could find. He didn't expect a reply. He didn't deserve one. But he sent it anyway. Because some confessions weren't about redemption. They were about removing the last lie from your name. Leah Harper never needed the world to understand her. She needed only that the world see the truth, and once it did, she disappeared again. While reporters and curators scrambled to secure interviews, exhibitions, and rights, she answered none of them. She returned to her quiet life, still painting in the corner of her grandmother's home. The same chipped easel, the same cracked window letting in the same Brooklyn air. The frenzy outside had no place inside. Her silence wasn't mystery, it was clarity. She didn't want to rise through fame. She wanted something far rarer, peace and justice measured not in headlines, but in memory. She had already said everything she came to say, and she said it in strokes, not sound. Still, the world kept talking. Publications from London to Tokyo now called her the voice of generational reckoning. Art schools studied her technique, trying to decipher where emotion ended and mastery began. The name Leah Harper had outgrown the scandal. It was no longer just about revenge, it was renewal. Her refusal to monetize the moment made her even more mythical. She rejected commercial galleries, turned down a book deal, and handed 3 of her most acclaimed works to a neighborhood shelter, insisting they be kept in the children's area. Critics didn't know what to do with that. "She's throwing away a fortune," one wrote. Another corrected him. "She's reclaiming the value." Meanwhile, Elliot Lancaster sat alone in a borrowed townhouse far from Manhattan, reduced from magnate to ghost in under a month. His days were filled with the kind of silence he once paid staff to remove. He wandered from room to room, reading old letters, burning others, and spending hours looking out a window at nothing. Every attempt to reclaim his voice in the media was ignored or rejected. One journalist replied bluntly, "The audience already closed the book, Mr. Lancaster. You don't get to write the ending now." He didn't argue. He had no fight left. What he had, instead, was an emerging understanding of how thin the walls of power truly were. The painting, once the subject of his mockery and centerpiece of his shame, had been removed weeks earlier. He'd donated it quietly to a local museum, without plaque or credit. It now hung in a quiet corner of an exhibit on lost voices. Visitors often stopped in front of it, drawn not by celebrity, but by sorrow. Some cried. Others said nothing, only stood there, held by the stillness of its defiance. The museum staff never announced its origins. They didn't have to. The work spoke louder than any name could. Back in Brooklyn, a new painting sat unfinished in Leah's studio. Unlike the others, this one was softer, the edges uncertain, the center faded like something once sharp but now dissolving. Her grandmother watched her work quietly. One afternoon, she asked if everything was over now. Leah paused, looked at her canvas, and replied, "It didn't end. It changed shape." The old woman nodded. That was enough. Art blogs continued to track her, but there was less to report. She wasn't seen at events, didn't post, didn't announce anything. Yet her influence kept spreading. Unknown artists began referencing her techniques. Murals appeared in cities bearing initials LH, with similar themes of memory, silence, resistance. Some believed they were hers, others imitators. Leah never clarified. She didn't need to point one evening. She walked to the corner store for tea and found a boy sketching on the sidewalk. He was alone, focused, unaware of the world around him. She paused, watching silently. When he noticed her, he smiled shyly and said, "Want to see?" She nodded. The drawing was raw but honest. "It's about my mom," he said. "She's gone, but sometimes I think she visits when I draw." Leah looked at him for a long moment, then knelt and whispered, "Then don't stop. Ever." That was all she said before walking home, the tea forgotten. Meanwhile, Elliot made one final attempt to reach out. He wrote a second letter, longer, not apologizing again, but reflecting. He spoke of envy, of watching talent bloom beside him, and fearing he'd never measure up. He admitted he didn't destroy Harper out of greed alone, but shame. "He was braver than me," he wrote. "He bled into canvas while I hid behind contracts." He signed it with his full name and added no return address. He left it at the museum desk, unsure if it would be delivered, unsure if it mattered. He had begun to accept that some wounds don't close with words. Months passed. Winter softened into spring. Leah's name faded from headlines, but settled into history. College lectures now referenced her debut as a pivotal moment in contemporary art. Museums redefined street artist with her name at the top. But in Brooklyn, she still woke early, still cleaned her brushes in the same jar, still painted without an audience. That was the victory no one could measure. Her refusal to be consumed by the very system that devoured her father. Elliot eventually moved again, this time to a quiet cabin far north. He didn't announce it. He didn't invite guests. He brought with him only one painting, an original by Harper from their early days, and signed, likely forgotten. He hung it in the smallest room, not to display, but to remember. Each morning, he sat beside it with coffee, saying nothing, as if finally learning to listen. And far away, in a city that never noticed her leaving, Leah Harper painted. Not for headlines, not for justice anymore, but because even after truth wins, the story must still be told. The collapse came without spectacle, but its silence was deafening. Elliot Lancaster had once been the man whose presence turned rooms into stages. Now, his name disappeared from boardroom memos, his photos quietly removed from press kits, and his voice absent from the events he once dominated. His resignation wasn't followed by interviews or apologies, just an official notice sent through a proxy. Investors wasted no time reshaping the firm's image, distancing it from the man whose downfall had become synonymous with corporate hubris and aesthetic blindness. His name no longer opened doors, it closed them. And yet, in private, Elliot barely reacted. It was not stubbornness. It was the eerie calm of a man realizing the finality of something he denied for years. Behind closed doors, board members murmured that it was better this way. He was an asset once, one said, but now he's just history with a shadow. That sentiment was shared quietly in clubs and lounges across Manhattan. Former allies stopped returning calls, too busy protecting their own reputations. The city he'd once conquered moved on as if he'd never existed. Even tabloids, always hungry for scandal, lost interest once the initial buzz faded. He had become irrelevant, and for someone like Elliot, irrelevance was more crushing than disgrace. What haunted him most wasn't the public shaming. It was that people had begun to remember David Harper for what he truly was, a visionary silenced too soon, a voice distorted by betrayal. A documentary had surfaced on a major streaming platform, pulling from interviews with former students, lovers, and critics. They spoke not of scandal, but of spirit. Archival footage of Harper painting in silence, his movements precise, his eyes alight with emotion, played beside narration that called him the artist who painted pain without demanding pity. Elliot watched the film alone, surrounded by unopened mail and fading opulence. He saw himself in the background of one clip, barely 28, eyes full of ambition, unaware that history would one day circle his name in red, not as a champion, but as a warning that in the days that followed, the walls of his townhouse began to feel smaller. Not physically, he had space, always had, but spiritually. The rooms echoed with choices he could no longer justify. He moved through them like a ghost, touching things he once flaunted, limited edition sculptures, rare first editions, autographed canvases, but finding no joy in them. They were reminders, not treasures. He packed several pieces into crates and arranged for them to be donated. No receipts, no announcements. It was not an act of redemption. It was surrender. Meanwhile, the name Leah Harper continued to resonate in subtler ways. Her face wasn't plastered across magazines, but her initials kept appearing in public murals, in whispered gallery installations, in small placards beside canvases titled only by emotion, grief, in echo, inheritance, absence. Framed. She didn't speak publicly, but her art now spoke across borders. Students wrote theses on her. Professors built syllabi around her. And yet, she remained unreachable, uninterested in the mechanisms of fame. It was this resistance that preserved her integrity. She was not a recluse by necessity, but by conviction. Elliot's health began to falter, not dramatically, but subtly. He ate less, slept poorly, woke often with the same dream, standing in a room where every wall bore a different painting, and all of them looked back at him with David's eyes. The dreams didn't scare him, they exhausted him. It was as if the unfinished business of the past had taken physical form and now demanded payment in fragments of peace. He tried therapy twice. The sessions were brief, uncomfortable. He had spent too long performing certainty to unlearn it in an hour. The only thing he completed with clarity was the sale of his penthouse. He did it quietly, off-market, to a foreign buyer. With the proceeds, he paid off old debts, personal and professional. Then, with what remained, he vanished from New York without notice. No farewell dinner, no press statement, just silence. The city hardly blinked. Another name crossed off its list of former titans that he relocated to a rural town in Vermont, buying a modest cottage with a view of an empty field. It wasn't isolation he sought, it was invisibility. He spent his days reading, walking, occasionally writing in a leather journal he never intended to publish. The painting he'd donated to the local museum, a piece by Leah that once hung mockingly in his home, became a quiet sensation. Visitors didn't know its story. It wasn't labeled, but they stood before it as if it whispered something they couldn't quite name. And Elliot, who sometimes wandered through the museum, never stopped at that painting. He simply passed it, slowing slightly, letting his breath catch for a moment, and then moving on. News of his downfall eventually stopped circulating. Younger generations didn't know his name. His firm survived, rebranded. And the art world? It evolved. Leah's quiet influence shaped an entire wave of creators who believed in dignity before exposure, message before market. Her refusal to commodify grief became a template for resistance in an era obsessed with virality. She was not seen often, but her work was, and it kept appearing in places where truth had once been erased. Back in Vermont, Elliot received a single envelope one winter morning. No return address. Inside was a photograph, the painting he'd bought from Leah, now redone. The core image remained, a fractured heart between colors, but now, in one corner, a wooden bench had been painted in. Empty. Waiting. It was the smallest addition, but it shifted the entire tone. It wasn't vengeance anymore. It was invitation. Or maybe forgiveness. Or maybe just understanding. There was no note. No signature. Just the image. Elliot looked at it for a long time. Then he placed it on his mantle and sat down. He didn't smile, but something in his eyes softened, like the last ember of a long fire finally cooling into quiet. He didn't need to know if she'd sent it. He only needed to know that it existed. Elliot never expected an answer. He sent a letter not for reconciliation, but as a final act of recognition, an acknowledgement that his choices had torn through lives he never bothered to revisit. So when days turned into weeks with no reply, he wasn't surprised. Leah's silence wasn't cruel, it was consistent. She had always answered with absence, a refusal to let anyone force her into resolution. She owed him nothing. And in that nothing, Elliot began to live differently. No schedule, no advisors, no hunger for relevance. Just long walks, slow mornings, and the echo of a name he once erased, now echoing louder with each passing day. He watched the seasons turn with unfamiliar stillness. He no longer filled time with meetings or obligations. Instead, he reread books he'd once quoted without finishing, cooked meals he never used to prepare himself, and studied local history out of sheer curiosity. What shocked him most wasn't how quiet the world had become. It was how peaceful it felt to not be needed. The hunger that had driven him to power had withered. In its place was a strange, humbling clarity. For years, he'd lived to be seen. And now, in invisibility, he finally saw point one morning. A neighbor invited him to a small gathering at the town's library. The museum had partnered with a local artist collective to showcase pieces from anonymous donors. Elliot almost declined, but something tugged at him. He arrived late, hoping to blend into the crowd. But the moment he stepped inside, he felt the shift. There, against a pale gray wall, hung a new painting. The same colors, the same broken structure. But it wasn't the original. It was another one, similar, but altered. In the lower corner, another edition, a hand resting gently on the back of that once empty bench. He stood there for several minutes, unnoticed, heart pounding with something closer to awe than fear. There was no plaque, no signature, but it was her. It had to be. And this time, it wasn't a confrontation. It was something else. A gesture, a moment carved out of restraint. He didn't cry, but he felt something shift deep inside. As if a locked door had quietly opened and invited an air he didn't know he'd been missing. Back in Brooklyn, Leah continued painting in private. Her work, once raw with grief, had begun to change. The lines softened. The colors grew warmer. She hadn't forgotten the past, but she no longer painted from it. Now, she painted from what came after, the quiet rebuilding. the spaces made sacred by survival. Her grandmother, weaker now but still wise, often sat beside her and watched. "You forgive him?" she asked once, not out of judgment, but curiosity. Leah didn't answer. She didn't need to. Forgiveness wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was just letting go of the need to reopen a wound. Though the art world still speculated about her every move, Leah gave them nothing. She refused retrospectives, turned down honorary degrees, even avoided interviews framed as celebrations. Her work was enough. It traveled without her, whispered between cities, showed up in churches, clinics, schools, places where healing was more useful than history. Critics eventually stopped trying to label her. "She paints what's necessary," one wrote. That was enough. Elliot started writing again. Not books, not essays, just reflections. Pages and pages of thoughts unspoken, memories unfiltered. He never intended to share them. It was his way of recording the parts of himself he never let surface. Some entries were confessions, others letters to people long gone. His mother, David, even Leah. He wrote to understand, not to persuade. And slowly, the pages replaced the noise in his mind. He visited the museum every week now, never speaking to staff, never staying long. Just enough to see the painting. Just enough to remember that even in silence, something had been returned. To him, not his name, not his reputation, but a sense of truth he'd never earned but was finally willing to hold. The pain was still there, but it no longer punished him. It just sat beside him, like an old companion. Leah, far away, received a package one spring morning. Inside was no letter, just a small wooden box. Inside the box was a single page from an old sketchbook, one she remembered from her childhood. It had been her father's, and on it was one of his early concepts, a rough, unfinished landscape titled Inheritance. She had thought it lost forever. She didn't ask how Elliot had gotten it. She didn't question his reason for returning it. She simply placed it on her shelf, between two jars of brushes, and let it sit there like a chapter closed gently. Neither of them spoke again. There were no more letters, no final conversations. But the quiet between them stopped being sharp. It became something else, an understanding that not all stories end with resolution. Some just keep evolving, one silent gesture at a time. Elliot sold the last property in his name without telling anyone. No press release, no lawyers with polished shoes delivering statements. Just a wire transfer and a key slid across a desk. He left the townhouse in Vermont as quietly as he had. Arrived and moved into a smaller, older house tucked between two maple trees on the edge of a quiet town no one ever wrote about. It had a creaky porch, a fireplace that smoked too much, and a kitchen barely big enough for two. And yet, it was the first place he had ever chosen without trying to impress anyone. He spent his mornings walking dirt trails, his evenings reading. Letters from himself that he never intended to send. He had nothing left to prove, no titles to protect. What remained were the small things: a warm cup of coffee, the sound of birds outside, the sharp clarity of solitude. He kept no art on his walls. The only piece he owned now was the photograph of the redone painting Leah had somehow sent or allowed to find him. He framed it in wood from the property and set it on a shelf above the fireplace, not as decoration, but as witness. The image haunted him less now. It had become part of the rhythm of his days. Occasionally, when neighbors visited for coffee, they'd notice it and ask about the artist. He never explained. He just said, "It's a long story," and smiled with the kind of weight that told them not to push further to die in that town. Elliot was simply the older man who didn't talk much but offered firewood to neighbors before winter storms. He volunteered twice a week at the local library, mostly shelving returned books and repairing damaged covers. The librarian was young and kind, and asked no questions about his past. She didn't need to. Everyone could tell that he was a man who had once carried too much and now walked a little lighter, though never weightless. There was peace in that, a peace built not from redemption, but from resignation lived with grace. Meanwhile, in a different city, Leah continued to paint in the same room where it all began. Her grandmother had passed quietly one morning, without pain or fanfare, simply closing her eyes and letting go. Leah mourned in silence, not with tears but with brushes, painting grief into textures only she could understand. She didn't pause her work, she changed its rhythm. Her new pieces were quieter, more spacious, less about confrontation, more about memory. Her name still held power in the art world, but she refused to use it as currency. When a renowned European museum offered her a lifetime retrospective, she declined and suggested they showcase works by new, undocumented artists instead. "The ones who don't paint for recognition," she wrote. "The ones who paint to breathe." She rarely spoke of Elliot. Only once did she mention him to a friend, describing him as a man who finally understood that silence can be an answer too. There was no bitterness in her tone, only the kind of compassion that comes from having chosen not to carry someone else's guilt. Leah didn't forgive because she was asked to. She forgave because she no longer needed to stay angry to stay strong. Her art now carried the energy of someone who had made peace with being unfinished, who no longer needed to be loud to be heard. Occasionally, Elliot would hear about her work through art magazines he picked up at the library. Her name came up less frequently, but always with reverence. A small exhibit in Amsterdam, a mural outside a clinic in Buenos Aires, a collaborative piece with orphaned children in Morocco. Every mention reminded him of how far she had reached. While refusing to climb, she hadn't built a legacy. She had planted 1 afternoon. A package arrived at Elliot's door with no return label. Inside was a small, bound book, a limited-run publication of Leah's sketches. It contained no introduction, no biography, just raw pages. Some were barely lines. Others were detailed, emotional, pages smeared with watermarks that looked like accidental tears. Elliot opened it slowly, page by page, until he reached one with a familiar shape, an old bench, drawn faintly, with two figures sitting side by side, facing away. No faces, no names, just presence. He ran his fingers across the paper, not to understand, but to feel. It was enough that he placed the book next to the photo on the shelf and sat down by the fire. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Inside, there was no music, no dialogue, just the crackle of wood and the deep, unspoken acceptance of a life no longer in motion, but not yet at its end. Elliot didn't need an ending anymore. He had found something rarer than closure, continuance. Not a second chance, but a different path walked quietly. Snow began to fall early that year, soft and slow, coating Elliot's porch like a hush settling over everything left unsaid. He didn't mark the date as anything special, but it happened to be his birthday. There was no cake, no calls, no reminders, only a quiet morning, a kettle warming over the stove, and the steady weight of winter pressing against the glass. He sat in his usual chair by the fire, hands wrapped around a mug, staring into the same stillness that had accompanied him for months. Outside, the trees stood bare, patient. Inside, the room had grown smaller but warmer, the way a lived-in space folds around someone who's finally stopped reaching for more. On the table lay the photograph of the painting, his painting, but no longer his in any way that mattered. The empty bench now filled, the brushstrokes softer, the colors calmer. Next to it, the sketchbook she'd sent. He hadn't touched it since the day it arrived, though its presence felt as familiar now as a door that always remained unlocked. He reached for it with the same reverence one reserves for something not quite sacred, but deeply personal. He turned to that same sketch, the two figures on the bench, and looked at it a little longer this time, not searching for meaning, just absorbing what had been given to him. No one else knew the shape of his life anymore. He didn't tell stories about the past, didn't correct the internet's version of events. He let the myth stand, let the world draw its own conclusions. What mattered now were the smaller moments. A neighbor waving across the road, the cat that occasionally climbed onto his porch for warmth, the handwritten list of groceries on the fridge. These things had no headlines, no legacy, but they had presence. And presence, he'd learned, could be enough. That afternoon, a light knock came at the door. A local girl, no older than 10, stood there holding a stack of flyers for a school fundraiser. She paused at the threshold, glancing past him to the framed photo above the fireplace. "I've seen that painting," she said, pointing. "It's at the museum." Elliot nodded. "Yes, it is." She tilted her head. "It makes people stop. I saw a lady crying in front of it once." He smiled gently, took a flyer, and offered her a cookie from the tin he always kept near the door. She left without knowing who he was. He preferred it that way. Years earlier, Elliot would have wanted to correct her, to explain the painting, its origins, the scandal. But now, he understood that stories grow beyond their creators, and sometimes, the quietest version is the one that matters most. He didn't need to defend himself. The truth, once buried, had risen without his permission, and in its rise, it had made room for something else. Not redemption, not exoneration, but a softened gaze, a slower heartbeat at dusk. He walked to the small museum 2 blocks away. He entered without speaking, a familiar ritual. The security guard nodded. No one asked him questions anymore. He stood in front of the painting, now hanging alone in a narrow alcove, lit by a single overhead bulb. Visitors came and went. Some whispered, others stood silently. Elliot didn't either. He simply looked, not for meaning, not for forgiveness, but for reflection. In the stillness of that corner, he felt the weight of time, everything done, everything lost, everything endured. He never told anyone about the last conversation he'd had with David Harper. It hadn't ended in shouting or doors slammed. It had ended in a question David had asked without expecting an answer. What will be left of you when the applause stops? For years, Elliot had avoided that thought, filling the silence with noise. But here, now, with the applause long gone and the silence complete, he finally understood. And it didn't hurt. When he left the museum that evening, the snow had deepened. He walked home slowly, not minding the cold. The street lamps flickered on, and each step felt steady, unhurried. He passed a group of teenagers laughing on the corner, a couple holding hands, a boy tossing snow into the air just to watch it fall. Life was moving, always would. And for the first time, he didn't feel outside of it. Just quieter, just part of it, in the background, where things no longer needed his control to matter. Back in his living room, he stoked the fire, poured a glass of water, and sat down with the sketchbook once more. No pens, no annotations, just the pages. As they were, the art didn't ask anything of him. It simply offered space. And in that space, Elliot breathed, quietly, fully. The house creaked in the wind. The flames flickered against the glass. And outside, the snow kept falling, soft, indifferent, eternal.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Your support helps us grow and bring you even more amazing content. See you in the next one.